What if Professor Moriarty wasn't a criminal mastermind, but a scientist obsessed with understanding human nature? What if instead of controlling people, he simply watched them? That's basically Lorentz Butterfly. And after finishing version 3.5, I genuinely think she's one of the most fascinating characters Reverse 1999 has ever written. Now, most people remember the Turquoise Serpent Club for the murders, the occult paintings, and the tragedy surrounding Muriel. But the more I thought about the story, the more I realized that those things aren't actually the heart of the event. They're just pieces of a much larger puzzle. At its core, version 3.5 is about observation. It's about people desperately trying to preserve something that's already slipping away. And most importantly, it's about a woman who treats the world like a giant experiment. The entire story begins with a simple card game. Through calculations and deduction, Lorentz Butterfly manages to use Centurion's absurd luck to secure a victory. As her prize, she takes an invitation to the Turquoise Serpent Club. To Centurion, it's worthless trash. To Butterfly, it's a clue. Hidden within the invitation are traces of an ancient Aztec ritual and evidence of a Manus Vindictae operation involving the smuggling of a mysterious pigment into Mexico City. At the same time, Butterfly sends a letter containing her findings to Laplace. The information eventually reaches Enigma, who dispatches Loggerhead to investigate. In Mexico, Loggerhead is introduced to Ramona, a local exorcist who possesses sharp instincts and a talent for uncovering the truth. Through a copying spell attached to a candle, both of them are dragged into the Turquoise Serpent Club when Butterfly activates the invitation's teleportation array. What follows appears to be a classic murder mystery. During an auction, as a painting called Lady by the Lake is being sold, a woman suddenly dies. There are no visible wounds, no poison, no attacker. She simply suffocates as though she is drowning. The death perfectly matches a string of bizarre murders that have been occurring throughout Mexico City. As the investigation progresses, Ramona begins connecting seemingly unrelated clues. Every victim had been near a painting created with the same unusual turquoise pigment. Eventually, she realizes the horrifying truth. The ritual isn't being performed by the club itself. It's being carried through the paintings. The artworks are acting as vessels for the ritual, turning ordinary paintings into instruments of death. The trail eventually leads Ramona and Loggerhead to the Vigila's Bureau. And that's where the story transforms from a murder mystery into a tragedy. The culprit is Muriel. And honestly, Muriel might be one of the most heartbreaking characters Reverse 1999 has ever introduced. Muriel wasn't motivated by power, greed, or revenge. He was motivated by grief. After losing his friend and teacher Teresita, he became obsessed with finding a way to bring her back. In pursuit of that goal, he joined the Manus Vindictae and began experimenting with forbidden resurrection techniques. He sealed fragments of his memories into the turquoise pigment and used the Mythos Sea as a medium to reconstruct Teresita's existence. But there was a flaw in the ritual, a devastating flaw. Every time Muriel attempted to recreate Teresita, he lost a piece of his own memory. Think about that for a moment. The harder he tried to remember her, the more he forgot her. The more desperately he chased the past, the more of himself he sacrificed. When Ramona enters the Mythos Sea, she finally uncovers the terrible truth. The memories preserved within it don't belong to Teresita at all. They belong to Muriel. The resurrection was never bringing Teresita back. It was merely creating an illusion using fragments of Muriel's own fading memories. By the time he realizes what has happened, it's already too late. Muriel spent years trying to preserve the memory of someone he loved, only to discover that he had been slowly destroying those memories himself. In the end, he dissolves into the paint and becomes a colorful hummingbird, disappearing into the sea of memories he spent so long pursuing. But Muriel isn't the only tragic figure in this story, because standing behind him is Añil. And in many ways, Añil is even more dangerous. Muriel acted because he couldn't let go of the past. Añil acted because he stopped believing in the future. As an artist, Añil eventually became disillusioned. He looked at the world around him and concluded that art couldn't truly change anything. Paintings couldn't end suffering. Murals couldn't improve society. Beauty couldn't solve humanity's problems. So instead of creating art inspired by tragedy, He transformed tragedy itself into art. The murders became part of the masterpiece. The victims became part of the canvas. And Muriel became the instrument that made it all possible. That's what makes Añil so terrifying. He understands exactly what's happening. He knows people are dying. Yet he allows it to continue because he no longer believes anything truly matters. But despite everything Muriel and Añil do, neither of them are the true focus of version 3.5. The real heart of the story is Lorentz Butterfly. Everything about Butterfly points toward one central concept: chaos. Her name is an obvious reference to the butterfly effect and Edward Lorenz, the father of chaos theory. Even her visual design references the famous Lorenz attractor, a mathematical model used to describe systems that appear random but actually follow hidden patterns. And that philosophy defines her entire worldview. Butterfly sees the world as a giant non-linear system. Human desires, ambitions, fears, and emotions are simply variables interacting within a massive equation. While everyone else gets emotionally involved, Butterfly remains detached. She observes. And this is where the Moriarty comparison becomes interesting. If you've ever read Sherlock Holmes, Butterfly feels remarkably similar to Professor Moriarty. Not because she's evil, but because of how she views humanity. Moriarty was a mathematical genius who saw society as a system that could be analyzed and predicted. People became pieces on a board, variables within an equation. Butterfly operates in a surprisingly similar way. She studies people, predicts their behavior, and places them in situations that reveal who they truly are. The difference is that Moriarty wanted control. Butterfly wants understanding. Moriarty manipulates the board to achieve his goals. Butterfly watches the board to learn how it works. That's what makes her so fascinating and, honestly, so unsettling. When Larissa faced betrayal and exile, Butterfly didn't comfort her. She handed her a revolver and observed the outcome. When the murders began in Mexico, she quickly understood far more than she revealed. Yet, she chose not to interfere. Even when Ramona was being consumed by the Mythos Sea, Butterfly waited until the very last possible moment before taking the shot that shattered the mural. Again and again, she chooses observation over intervention, not because she enjoys suffering, but because she genuinely believes that observing human nature reveals truths that interference would destroy. And then the story delivers its most brilliant twist. The woman obsessed with observation has a blind spot. Butterfly is colorblind. The entire investigation revolves around a distinctive turquoise pigment, yet she struggles to perceive it properly. The person who prides herself on seeing patterns others miss is unable to fully perceive one of the most important clues in the entire case. It's a small detail, but it completely changes her character. For the first time, the observer becomes imperfect. For the first time, the genius reveals a flaw. For the first time, Lorentz Butterfly becomes Marguerite. And that's why the final confrontation between Butterfly and Añil is one of my favorite scenes in the entire story. Butterfly uncovers Añil's involvement. Añil uncovers Butterfly's secret. Neither exposes the other. Neither wins. Neither loses. Instead, they acknowledge each other's imperfections. And then Añil hands Butterfly a vial of silver pigment. I don't think that silver pigment is simply evidence or a reward. I think it's symbolic. Throughout the story, the turquoise pigment represented memory, obsession, grief, illusion, and death. The silver pigment appears only after the truth has been revealed and the illusions have been shattered. It feels like a final acknowledgement between two people who have seen through each other's masks. And that's why I think the Turquoise Serpent Club isn't really a murder mystery. It's a story about people desperately trying to preserve something that was always destined to disappear. Muriel tried to preserve the past, Añil tried to preserve meaning, Ramona tried to preserve reality, and Butterfly tried to preserve objectivity. All of them failed. And somehow that's exactly what makes version 3.5 one of the most fascinating stories Reverse 1999 has ever told. Because by the end of the story, the greatest mystery was never the murders, it was Lorentz Butterfly. Or perhaps the woman hiding behind that name, Marguerite.